Hi, thank you for joining us today. We're going to be discussing considerations for clinical trial planning to support successful regulatory submissions for in vitro diagnostics. I'm Margot Borgel, Director for IVD Global Regulatory Affairs, and I'm joined today by Nancy Morrison. Nancy has over 30 years of experience in regulatory affairs, including clinical trials and regulatory strategy. So Nancy, I'd like to start this discussion by talking about what are the primary concerns regulators have while reviewing IVDs, and how critical is the clinical data, and is that the ultimate focus of the review?
Thanks, Margot. Yes, I definitely believe clinical data is key. Particularly in the IVD space. We typically see in IVD 510Ks, about 60 to 80% of them will require some type of clinical data to support. So you obviously have to support it also with your performance data, but clinical data is key and will be a key focus area for the agency to review. And we see it virtually 100% in de novo, PMA, and companion diagnostic submissions. So even more important in those higher risk devices or novel devices that may be coming to the market. I think one of the things that is very critical that FDA will focus on a lot is what is the patient population that's going to both benefit from the IVD and is included in the clinical trial, and making sure those two things align. The other is we see a heavy emphasis with FDORA that passed in 2022 around diversity in clinical trials, and that's very important in the IVD space as well, that you've got a good representation by ethnicity, by race, by gender, by age. And FDA's pretty much always ask for subgroup analysis in those different groups. But what we're seeing now is a little more increase in focus on, did you have enough patients in those subgroups to do some valid analysis work of them? So just keep that in mind. Like, it's not necessarily just about the overall sample size, but it's also the subgroups that are important. And this makes it even more challenging. We find a lot of bank samples. That's a great option if you've got that, and maybe you have some long-term clinical data to go with it to support your use. But if that information on, the demographics of the population where those bank samples were grabbed, it makes it hard to use them. So before you go off and do a expensive study, you might want to just take a look and make sure you've got all the data you need to analyze it.
Great points. So from an EU perspective for IVDR, I think it's the same as FDA, and that clinical data is critical to the approval of your device. Notified body reviewers are primarily concerned with safety of the patient, the demonstration of the clinical performance of the device, and the scientific validity of the analyte. I think really the most critical thing is to make sure that the intended use that is indicated for the device is consistent with the clinical performance study that was conducted, and whatever indications are within the IFU for the device have also been touched upon within that performance evaluation and that clinical study. The other key aspect for IVDR is that we're in a transition period. So there are new requirements for documentation for what's required for a clinical study. This comes from Annex 13 of the regulation. So it's important, if you're running a study and you have not run one under IVDR, that you take a look at these requirements, that you have a clinical performance study plan that meets those requirements, because the notified body will push back if this is not there. So Nancy, what do you think are some of the clinical trial related challenges that manufacturers may tend to overlook? So for example, when they're designing and executing a study, that if they finish the study, it might be too late when they eventually realize it.
Yeah, people are always anxious to get their product on the market. So there's a propensity sometimes to want to skip the pre-submission meeting with FDA. It adds to the timeline. It takes 90 minutes. It can sometimes have a second round of questions and discussion to reach agreement. And, what we find is sometimes when you do that, you miss some little piece that wouldn't have been hard to incorporate in your clinical study, but after the fact, it's too late to go back and do that or fix it on the back end. And some of these are just minor additions, right? So maybe, or it's a slight change. You select a certain comparator that you're going to run your samples against, but FDA has a reason why that's not a good comparator. So that's hard to change after the fact if you've already run all those samples. Could be that they want another lab value on those subjects just to make sure that they can stratify them by disease condition or other attribute. And so trying to go back and get that value after the fact is hard. The same with inclusion, exclusion. Probably one of the most difficult IVD pre-subs I've had with FDA was around this. Like, we wanted an all-comers type of indication that the test would be good for everybody, but the way the samples were collected put certain limitations on it, so we didn't have that full patient population. Just want to think about that, empowering the study. It's hard to go back and change your statistical analysis plan after your samples have been run.
In that example you gave with the inclusion-exclusion criteria, did you have to go back and gather additional clinical data, or did you have to update the indication so that it was a different patient population? How did that end up?
It was required a whole new study. So, and it was a painful one because we had followed the patients for a couple years after the diagnostic, looking at clinical outcomes. And so by not being able to use that data, it really started the process all the way back at the beginning.
Yeah. And I think that's, what goes right into what I've seen is that often there's an effort to get the device on the market as quickly as possible. And so you're not necessarily building all of those regulatory aspects in, right? And thinking about your design specifications when you're planning that study. So, if you start a study before that design is truly locked down, right? So in this case, maybe you thought you would have a specific patient population and then you wanted to open it up afterwards. You can't really do that without starting over. So, make sure you know what your indications are before you design that study, and also make sure your device is locked down, that it works how you think it's going to work within that patient population. Those analytical performance studies are really critical, and having those done before you start designing your clinical study, it's very important, right? So if you kind of try to do those things simultaneously, you run the risk of not having all of the information to appropriately plan your clinical study. And then that backfires on the back end, either when you're not hitting your true indications or you don't have the data you expected to have. So let's talk final thoughts. What do we think sponsors need to know? And I'll start with, consider if you have enough data to even start your pivotal study. Do you need a pilot study? Is your analytical testing complete and sufficient? These are critical steps that they slow you down getting to market, but in the long run, you could avoid costly repeats of trials, ongoing discussions with FDA or with your notified body to bridge those gaps that you didn't cover in your clinical study, or, having to repeat the study because your design has to change to accommodate the performance you need. All of these things I think are critical when you're designing a clinical trial.
I definitely agree. And I think there can be some advantage to taking small steps, right? Sometimes we know the potential of a platform and we want to get it out there as quickly as possible. But sometimes slowing down, narrowing the indications, focusing on what your test does best, can make that regulatory burden a little easier to get through. You get some experience, you get to market faster. And then I find it a lot easier to expand indications than necessarily it is to go in with the full suite of capabilities on the first go. So sometimes, right, baby steps are good.
Yeah, that's a great point. Get it out there, get it on the market. You could start making some income from that, and then you can expand the indications, patient population, sample type, as you need to. But you'll have it on the market and have a little bit easier barrier to entry. That's great. All right. Well, thanks for chatting with me today, Nancy. I think this was a great discussion and look forward to the next time.
Thanks, Margot.
Thanks.